Welcome to the Best Kind Design podcast, where we believe that the best kind of spaces support your emotional, mental, physical, and spiritual well-being. Here we explore how the spaces we dwell make us well and unwell. Consulting accomplished experts that are doing fascinating work on the cutting edge of science and senses, I am your host, Sonia Randall, interior architect and owner of Best Kind. Thank you so much for being here. Let's dive in. Hi, Julian. I'm so happy that you're here today. I'm excited to chat to you all things sound and design.
Thanks for having me.
I'm going to start with a fun question. How is the sound where you are today?
It's very quiet because I have an office cum studio which is sound treated, and I live in a pretty quiet place as well. Well, apart from nature sound, you've got to like wind if you live in Orkney, but it's quite a quiet day today, actually. So I'm in a quiet place.
So I've heard you say that you think people should take the time to enjoy mundane sounds. Was there a mundane sound that you enjoyed most recently?
Well, a lot of the sounds of nature are taken for granted a great deal of the time. And I'm lucky enough to be able to go for walks with our dogs, which I'll be doing a little later on, and to hear nothing but natural sound. I particularly love the surf on the beach very close to where we live. It's a rocky beach we go walking on. The sounds of the seabirds. I mean, these are things that it's all too easy to ignore if you're deep in thought about something else. But taking the time to listen to them actively and consciously is very rewarding because they're beautiful sounds. Little bubbling brooks coming out of the hills, running down onto the beach. Those kind of sounds give me great pleasure.
I love that. I am from a small island in Canada, and I grew up surrounded by a national park. There were literally moose in my backyard, and my house was near a bay, connected to the ocean. And so part of my daily life was hearing nature sounds of, the waves of the ocean and the rustling of the leaves and the wind in the trees. And now that I live in a city, I find that my body literally craves these sounds. I think, through the mindfulness and awareness, like you said, you start to notice that these sounds are not just pleasurable, but your body literally responds, and nature kind of helps it. Well, in my experience, it feels to me like nature regulates my nervous system. It really helps me to come into balance. So I love that. So for the listeners, how would you describe a healthy indoor sound environment?
Well, there's a lot of research now to back up what you just said, in that nature sound or biophilia, as it's presented in all the senses really to the professions of architect and interior designer, bringing the outdoors indoors is happening all over the world for a reason. The research tends to indicate that birdsong, gentle running water, rain, these sounds are actually good for us. They tend to ameliorate stress. They reduce stress. They create positive brain chemistry, dopamine, endorphins, those kinds of things. And they're also quite productive. So, a company I was involved in setting up last year, Moodsonic, which is at moodsonic.com, is installing this kind of biophilic sound in offices all over the world for really big companies, because it's been established that it is good for people's well-being, and it also helps with focus. So I would say the way we receive sound is very individual. It's hard to make sweeping generalizations. People will often ask me questions like, what's the best sound for working to? As I often say, it's quite possible there are people in the world for whom loud death metal music is the best sound for them to work to. That wouldn't be me. And it would be unusual, I would suggest, because music is quite a dense sound. It calls for a lot of attention, and it's therefore taking up quite a lot of cognitive bandwidth. Whereas sounds like birdsong, gentle running water, and so forth, these are sounds which have been around on this planet far longer than we have, sounds we evolved to, sounds that we're very used to having around us, and which take up very little cognitive bandwidth, while at the same time, as well as having the kind of physiological effects I was just talking about, reducing blood pressure, reducing stress hormones, and so forth, they help us to concentrate because they tend to reduce the impact of unwanted conversation. They blur out conversations away from us that we don't really need to hear. And that's the most distracting sound of all. So it's called masking, this principle of having a sound which masks sounds that are very distracting. Now, you can obviously mask by putting on headphones and listening to music, but I would argue that music is just as distracting as the conversation you're trying to mask. It may be more fun, it may be much more pleasurable, but it's also taking up quite a lot of cognitive load. So if you want my opinion about the best sound for a working environment or for a home, I would tend to go to nature and explore nature sounds. I mean, for the home, there's a lovely website called My Noise, which is full of wonderful sounds that you can play with. And there's plenty of it is free. I mean, he has a small subscription, I think. I'm not on commission here. For workspaces, Moodsonic is pathfinding in this and installing scientifically designed generative biophilic sound for big companies around the world and having a wonderful effect on people's well-being and productivity.
You know, as you were mentioning that nature sounds have literally been associated with lowering people's blood pressure, what are the specific chemical reactions in the body that's associated when a person is exposed to nature sounds? Are there any specific hormones released? What's going on there exactly?
Well, sound can work for us or against us. So if you think about designed pleasant sound versus, let's just call it noise, unwanted or unpleasant sound, there's a spectrum of responses to sound, depending on how pleasing it is, also how dense or information rich it is, and also how loud it is and how stimulating it is, which may be, if it's, for example, music, that would be about how many beats per minute, what the pace of the tempo of the music is, because there's masses of research now to show that, for example, fast-paced music causes people to walk faster, chew faster in restaurants, do everything faster. So we are entrained by sound around us. We tend to accelerate in fast-paced sound and slow down in slow-paced sound. So that affects all of our bodily rhythms. Sound affects us physiologically all the time. So a sudden sound, like a sudden noise behind you, somebody dropping something, that is something that we have evolved, like every other living thing on this planet, to interpret as potentially a threat. So there are no animals and no vertebrates on Earth that don't have ears. Sensing vibration is the most primal form of self-preservation. It may be food, if it's vibrating around you, or it may be a threat. It may be a predator. So sensing that vibration is something that even cells do, and certainly multicellular organisms do. And it goes right up to, major organisms like us. And that's embedded into us. We've been doing it for hundreds of thousands or millions of years if you go back to kind of proto-humans. So sound goes very deep, very fast. You respond to sound faster than you respond to visual signals, much faster, for that very reason. You can hear what's behind you. You can't see what's behind you. You hear in a sphere. You only see a cone in front of you. So it's a very primal sense, and it's keyed into all sorts of physical systems that we have in our bodies. Yes, hormones, brain chemistry. So, for example, stress-inducing sound, unpleasant noise, like if you're standing on a street trying to have a conversation with somebody and there's somebody drilling next to you, even that kind of sound, which you can see, it's not a threat, it will cause a release of cortisol, noradrenaline in your system. Whereas if you play yourself something beautiful like gentle surf or a babbling brook or something along those lines, birdsong, or beautiful music, you'll get dopamine, endorphins, those kind of positive, happy hormones flooding your system. You feel good. and your blood pressure will go down. And there's lots of research now showing there's a strong link between sound and blood pressure. And that means in the long term that noise exposure, even at a relatively low level, can have enormously negative effects on health. For example, it's been established that the threshold at which you suffer an increased risk of heart attack is only around 65 decibels of daily exposure, or regular exposure. Well, that's the average noise level in classrooms in Germany, according to recent research, and probably around the world. So if teachers are in that environment, group work, bad acoustics, lots of children talking, if you have to raise your voice to be heard, it's going to be about 65 decibels. Even some offices are at that level. And chronic exposure to that level is increasing our risk of heart attack, stroke, those kind of diseases. Teachers may well be shortening their lives by working in that environment, quite apart from losing their voices. And there's a huge proportion of teachers who've got permanent vocal damage from shouting day after day. So yes, sound can influence our body chemistry. It can influence our feelings, whether we feel happy or sad. You only have to think of music for that. But there'll be all sorts of sounds that anybody listening to this can think of, which would make them feel happy or would make them feel sad if they think about them and remember them. And then sound changes our productivity, our cognition, how well we can work, especially, as I said, other people's conversation. But it could be any sound that's quite dense or bothering. Any sound that's intermittent, not constant, is very hard to adapt to. If there's a banging door that bangs every couple of minutes, it drives you completely mad. So it's the difference between a dripping tap, which can be really irritating, compared to, for example, gentle rainfall, which has moved into a zone that we call stochastic sound. It's a kind of a wash of sound composed of random events, but they're not bothering you because you can't hear them individually. And then finally, sound changes our behavior. As I've said, it changes how fast we do things, how slowly we do things, whether we stay in a place or leave a place, which is very relevant for retailers who have yet to discover a lot of this, because many, many shops sound terrible, and shopping malls and so forth. It also changes what we do, whether we choose to buy something, whether we choose to react to something in a certain way, whether we're angry or sociable, whether we're antisocial, aggressive. You think about a lot of situations where there's conflict are situations where there's typically a lot of noise. Conflict doesn't tend to happen in the quiet. War is very noisy. Fights are very noisy. So noise is associated with that kind of conflict and aggression. So sound is affecting us all the time. It can affect us for good if we design it carefully, or it can have awful effects on our health and well-being, on our effectiveness and ability to focus and work, and on our happiness as well. It's a great servant, but a very bad master.
Wow, I love that. You said so many things there that I feel like people are really going to benefit from at home. So if we could distill this down, in terms of people creating a ideal sound environment, what would be the steps that you would recommend for them to achieve that?
Sure. Well, there are 4 steps to designing good sound in any space, 4 things to think about, if you like. The first and the most basic one is acoustics. It's very hard to make good sound in a room with terrible acoustics. And there are some things that we can do for any space, really, which will help us to create better acoustics. At the very basic level, actually, just stepping back from that before you even start making a space, site selection. Is it next to an airport? Is it next to a railway line? Is it next to something that's making a lot of noise? Try not to do that if you're designing a school or a hospital, please. And then we can think about journeys. There are lots of transitional spaces now in places like art galleries where you come in from a busy street and they have a transitional space that allows you to change your state as you move through to the inner sanctum. Well, that's an approach we could use in lots of different spaces, and I think that's got lots of power to it. And then there's room geometry. So this is before we get to the acoustics. Now, architects tend to love parallel surfaces, and I'm very glad to say that some very big companies now in America are moving away from that and moving towards trapezoidal design. There's a reason for that. If you have parallel hard surfaces, they bounce sound waves back and forth between them, and you get unpleasant booms and resonances. If you just take the walls slightly out of parallel, that stops, and you get a much more pleasant environment to be in. You can do this with ceilings as well, so that your ceiling and floor are not parallel. Walls, of course, because walls, ceilings, floors tend to be hard and they tend to reflect sound. So those are three things to think about: site selection, journeys, and geometry, before we get to the four major steps. Or let's compact it to three, I suppose. That's easy: acoustics, noise control, and soundscaping. So with acoustics, yes, we can absorb sound, and it's wonderful now that we've got so many amazing surfaces. It's not any longer a question of having just a grid ceiling that looks boring with square panels in it. I mean, yes, you can do that with acoustic panels, but you can have all sorts of clouds and floating surfaces and different types of panels now. They can look absolutely gorgeous. So I call this acousthetics. You don't have to have boring aesthetics in order to have great acoustics. And just have a look around at the products on the market, from people like Armstrong, Echophon, Rockfon. I mean, they're all doing this, and there are some wonderful surfaces available. And you can have them any color, and you can print on them so they can look amazing. So there's two things we want to do with acoustic surfaces, whether it's a ceiling, which incidentally is the most important surface. It tends to be the biggest that you can use in a room because there's stuff happening on the walls and certainly on the floor. So ceiling is where any acoustician will always come into a room and look up. It's the biggest area, and coverage is absolutely critical here. And it's also very effective. So you can have a ceiling that absorbs, and there's a number for that called the NRC, the noise reduction coefficient. And that is the percentage of the sound that comes back effectively. So if you have an NRC of 0.9, 0.9 would mean that only 10% of the sound reflects back. An open window has got an NRC of 1 because none of the sound comes back. So that's the way that number works. And that's really important if you want to damp down a space, because if the sound all bounces back off a hard ceiling, like a plasterboard ceiling is hard, and it will reflect a lot of sound back, at least half the sound, if not more. And of course, architects unfortunately love hard things: glass, concrete, steel, all sorts of stone surfaces, wood. Well, you can make metal or wood absorbent by having tiny perforations in it and an absorber behind the metal or the wood. So that can all be done now. And then the other thing we might want to look at is transmission of the sound through to the other side, particularly where privacy is important. For example, in a hospital or in an office. I mean, you don't want to hear somebody next door sacking somebody or giving somebody a pay rise when you didn't get one. I mean, there is, privacy is very important when you've got confidential information going on, and particularly in hospitals. And unfortunately, walls tend to not to go right up to what Americans call the deck, the soffit, the concrete surface above. They're stopped short, and the sound is very, very good at finding a way. If you have a wonderful soundproof wall and a door with a keyhole in it, the sound will find a way through. That keyhole will be enough. So it's only as good as the weakest point. Now, you can have ceilings and walls now that will both absorb and also block sound from moving through. And we want to really block sound from moving through as much as possible. I mean, it future-proofs a space if you have a ceiling throughout that's very good at blocking, because it means you can change the use of the space later on, and you don't have to worry about privacy, confidentiality, and so forth. So there's an ABC of acoustics. A is absorb. B is block, C is cover. And so that's acoustics. We can do ceiling treatments. We can do wall treatments with panels that look like pictures. They do great jobs now. You can have sound absorbing underlays under carpet to stop footfall from going down to the room below, which of course with a wooden floor and something hollow underneath it can be very bad. And honestly, I've been in offices. I did a piece of work for an agency that was in a building in Shoreditch, where the floor was hard stone, the walls were brick, the ceiling was they'd taken the ceiling out, so it was trendy exposed ceiling where you could see all the air conditioning and everything above. Every single surface was hard. And I said to them, honestly, you are going to have to tell people what shoes they can wear in this office, because it will be unbearable if people come in with hard heels at all. And they were planning to put a cafeteria into there as well. Well, my goodness, it may look nice, but it's going to be absolutely unfit for purpose. People won't be able to work there. So let's design for the ears as well as the eyes that way with acoustics. So that's the base level. Then you've got noise control. Things like not putting a cafeteria into a workspace. I mean, that's fairly basic, isn't it? You would think so, but I've lost count of how many times I've seen that done. Good closers on doors, for example, that make them shut quietly. And my absolute bête noire, which is metal chair and table legs on a stone floor with no glides, no felt, no plastic or rubber underneath. What a nightmare. Every time somebody moves, you get the most hideous noise. And I've seen restaurants where that's the case, and you can hardly hear yourself think. So just thinking about noise, the M&E, how loud is the HVAC? How loud are the big pieces of equipment that you've got to put in? Are they away? Are they vibrating the space and creating unpleasant bass vibrations throughout the space? Trying not to have, in cafes, for example, we all have to hear the coffee being made now and the baristas banging away and on the knockbox and so forth. Well, that's not particularly pleasant. And of course, then they put music in on top. I'll tell you a little secret here. Music on top of noise is just more noise. It doesn't work. So yes, we need to get the acoustics right. Then we need to think about removing noise that we don't need from the space. So creating a low noise floor, which is the sound in a space when it's fully operational, but there's nobody there. That's the noise floor, as low as possible. Then we can put some sound in. And we wouldn't want to do that if there's noise or bad acoustics. So it's not a kind of panacea to play some birdsong or some lovely nature sound into a horrible, noisy room. That's just more noise. So we need to neutralize the space first. Good acoustics, noise control, and then we can think about biophilia, which may require a decent sound system. And that's something that often gets value engineered out of the design process. We don't need $100 loudspeakers. We can surely have something that's $5 and get away with that. Well, I've been in lots of shopping malls where there's life safety based PA systems that were only ever designed to play an alarm sound in the event of a life safety issue. And somebody goes, "Oh, we've got loudspeakers. Why don't we play music?" And so you walk around and all you can hear is you don't know what tune it is. You don't know what's going on. It's just an irritating little noise in the background that's speeding you up and making you leave faster. Thanks very much. So let's, if we're going to have sound going into a space, we need a sound system that's capable, it's high enough quality to deliver the brand, the image, the corporate values, whatever it might be, and the sound and the impact of the sound that we want to have on people in that space. So this is all about designing with the ears. We experience the world in 5 senses, not one. And when you line things up and you have, yes, beautiful visual design, but let's not just forget that it sounds awful. Because if you have an awful sounding space, the visuals are undermined. If you have a space that sounds as beautiful as it looks, you get a thing called super additivity. And in super additivity, where you're combining the senses, you're giving the same message, 1 + 1 is much more than 2. It can be 10 or 20 times the impact. So designed for the ears as well, multi-sensory design. You get super additivity. And those are the steps to designing good sound in any space.
Wow, that was very informative. I feel like you gave listeners such a great step by step process that they can go through when designing optimal sound for their environment. Thank you for that. So let's switch to silence for a minute. How important is silence when designing sound for an environment?
Well, the great percussionist Dame Evelyn Glennie, whom I had the pleasure of interviewing, said something in, I think, her wonderful film, Touch the Sound, which I strongly recommend to everybody to get hold of and watch. It's amazing. She said, silence is a sound. And I agree with her. So it's not just an absence of sound. And you can have different qualities of silence as well. I mean, I've been in high mountains on a still day above the tree line where there are no birds, and the sound, the silence is infinite and vast and overwhelming. But equally, I've been in caves deep underground, and when you turn out the lights in a place like that, the silence is cloying and suffocating. So I think you can have different qualities of silence. Silence is essential in sound. It's the gaps between the words. It's the gaps between the notes. It's what makes sense of sound. Just as you can't have mountains without valleys, you can't have words or birds singing or music without silence as your baseline, silence as the context for everything. And there are some great books about silence. I was in a film a few years ago called In Pursuit of Silence, which was, I think, really well made. And again, I think that's available if you seek it out, probably streaming somewhere. It's a very good film about noise and silence and the relationship between them and us. But I wouldn't say silence is a sound to aim for. I mean, in certain places, yes. I remember going into Worth Church, which is part of Worth Abbey in Sussex. I went in there because it's an amazing architectural feat. It's like an upturned dome built into the side of a hill. Looks like a flying saucer has crashed or something. When you go in there, it's vast. It seats over 1,000 people. And in the center, there's one altar with a spotlight on it. And the rest of the place, when it's not operating, is dark. And you can sit there and the silence is absolutely glorious. It's a wonderful place to sit and unwind and chill. So some buildings, it's very appropriate to have silence. In other places, well, I mean, it's anathema, actually. I've been in offices where it's so quiet that the turning of a piece of paper is a major event. You know, people tut almost if you do that. And if you take a phone call in a room full of 20 people studiously working, like a library almost, if you take a phone call in that space, first of all, you're putting off all 20 people immediately because they can all hear you perfectly. And secondly, it's extremely embarrassing to have everybody listening to your conversation. So it's important in workspaces, unless it is a library, in which case everybody's reading. That's a collective contract, if you like, and it's perfectly right for people to go shh if you say anything and you're disturbing people. Well, that's a particular sort of workspace. And we do need quiet working space like that in offices where people can sit, think, study, reflect, plan, strategize, whatever it may be. But that's not possible to do if people are typing loudly even. So we need to think carefully about the type of work that's going on in each space. If we're into a collaborative space, well, open plan is the universal solution for that. Unfortunately, actually, it's the universal solution for all offices, and really open plan does not work for concentration, for solo working. It's very, very poor. That's why noise is the number one complaint in offices all around the world. In the Leesman Index, it's absolutely clear that lack of quiet working space and noise are the things that people find that's important to them. Those two things are rated very highly in terms of what's important to me in my workspace, and they're very dissatisfied with them. So it's the biggest gap on the Leesman Index. And the same with other surveys I've seen around the world. So in spaces like offices, we have to think carefully about what kind of work And of course, what kind of people? We live in a world where we're now very conscious of neurodiversity and diversity in general. Different people work better in different kinds of environments. So it's much more about what's called activity-based working, where we create different environments and allow people to move themselves to the appropriate space for who they are and the kind of work that they want to do right now. And that's, I think, a big difference from the old regimented office, which was kind of based on Taylorism originally, where everything's the same, everybody's got the same desk, we're just sat in serried ranks getting on with it. And that's not very effective when we've got such a variety of working modes and a variety of people that we need to cater for. And of course, we've got to attract them back into offices with a reason to be there, which means the office has got to be a great deal nicer than it was before. I talked to various people about this, and it's absolutely clear that the office of tomorrow has got to be more like an airport lounge, a hotel, high standards of comfort, food, drinks available, different types of space, much, much a higher bar than it used to be, because people have discovered that WFH is, for many people, preferable. And indeed, I think the latest Leesman survey found that WFH is also more productive for many people. So, that's a challenge to the office, and it's one the office is going to have to up its game to meet. So that was a long answer to your question. I hope there was something in there for everybody.
No, that was fabulous. I loved that. I was a teacher prior to being an interior architect. So the education system is very special to my heart. And, to kind of jump to the workplaces as well as the educational spaces. I'm sure there's others as well, but, just to name a couple, the reason why I asked about noise is because I'm a very big advocate for spaces within those environments where people can go and have an individual space where they can decompress. I think that we're all individuals, although we have similar systems. Our makeup is unique. And as you said, for personalized sound, we need a level of personalization in all regards in our collective spaces. So they need to kind of be comprised of collective and then individual spaces. But to this decompression kind of space, I feel like, outside of, people suffering from, stress related things like anxiety and such, just generally the level of stress on people nowadays is enormous. The load is quite high, just down to even, the noise that you hear on the streets, and just we're constantly taking in a lot of stimulus at once. So having this space where people can go and decompress and where they can, for lack of a better word, take a load off. I think silence is important there. Like obviously there can be elements in the space for people to individualize it, whether that's a bit of, the biophilic sounds or what have you. But a place where people can go and kind of take a beat and bring their nervous systems back to neutral, I think is really important. I think we all, need to have that space at the end of the day. So outside of that, I loved what you had to say about the future of workspaces in general. I completely agree with all of that. 100%. So I'd like to kind of go back to the noise, having noise in your environment and what that does to the body, in terms of, say, and go back to that educational setting and say there's a lot of noise there. Where my brain went when you said noise, and I'm thinking of a noisy environment, I'm thinking, okay, noise above, the 65 decibels that you had said, your cortisol is increasing. So basically your body is in a level of a stress response. And so then where my mind goes is, people have a different level of stress within their body at all times. So some people are probably literally in a fight or flight space while they're at work, while they're in an educational environment. I remember reading, at one point from varying psychologists that some people live, the majority of their days in fight or flight. And, so in that space, literally when you're in fight or flight, your body is physically in a space of responding and not receiving. So if you're in an educational setting or somewhere where it's a learning environment, how does noise impact your focus and productivity?
Well, in most cases, I would suggest there shouldn't be any noise. Noise being unwanted sound. Now, you can't obviously remove the sound of people doing things in a space where they're there to work, whether it's a classroom or an office. That's a desirable sound. You can, however, make sure that the sound is appropriate in different spaces, and you can also, as you just described, create decompression spaces where, perhaps silence for some people. There might be others that have got gentle nature sound in them, or ambient music. There are lots of sounds which people find very relaxing, which you could put into a space where, again, the colors would need to be right, maybe, muted light blues and things like that. There's a very good book. I interviewed its author some time ago, Dr. Sally Augustin, who's an expert on multisensory design. And I think her book's called Designology. And that's really worth having a look at, especially when it comes to neurodiverse people and designing spaces which are comfortable for people on the spectrum or whatever it might be. So, yes, let's have decompression spaces where people can go and allow them to go to those places, but let's not have noise. And really, if you have a classroom with good acoustics, which is really well designed and pleasant to be in, then you won't be talking about children shouting and the teacher shouting. So everything gets quieter. And there's plenty of research on this. I chaired a session some years ago about this. And it was clear from the research that if you treat classrooms, let's take those as it's what we're talking about right now, if you treat them with good acoustics and you reduce the reverberation time in the classroom from, they can be over a second, they can be 1.5 seconds. That's terrible. If you've got a meeting room, you want a reverberation time that's well under a second, ideally half a second or a bit less. If you've got that going on, then everything's calmer and stress levels are lower. Cortisol is far less. Galvanic skin response shows that the stress hormones are absent or very much lower. And so people get better results. Quite apart from anything else, the students can actually hear their education, which is not the case in many student classrooms. They're just not fit for purpose. And particularly the kids at the back, that's where the naughty kids sit anyway, they can't hear the education. So it's like watering a garden and missing the flowers. It's tragic. We focus all the time on sending education. How good is the curriculum? How good are the teachers? We don't ever talk about receiving it. And that's so important. So they'll receive it better, and both teacher and students will have a much, much better outcome in terms of well-being, in terms of happiness, in terms of calmness, and so forth. So acoustics really are at the root of all of this. And I'm working with a company in the UK, actually, which I'm very excited about at the moment, called BGR Education, who are creating wood-based classrooms to replace, I don't know about in the US, but in the UK, we've got lots and lots of prefabricated extra classrooms which have been put outside of school buildings, and they're all falling apart. And well, so a lot of our schools now, because they've got RAAC, this aerated concrete, which was installed in the 80s, 90s, and is now falling apart. And many schools in the UK have been closed because they're now dangerous. They're in danger of falling down. So this company is creating these beautiful classrooms, largely wood-based, with air filtration to reduce particulate matter and obviously things like COVID. And there's lots of evidence showing how effective that is in reducing absenteeism and ill health, with excellent temperature control, with good noise control so that outside noise doesn't come in, with good acoustics inside them, so that you've got students in a beautiful room, which is ideally designed for what it should be doing. And, you know, we've got lots and lots of schools in this country which were designed in the 19th century, built in the 19th century or the early 20th century, where everything is hard, everything is echoey, and how people get any education at all in them is quite remarkable. I mean, that means everybody's got to work so much harder to give and receive an education than in an ideally designed space like the ones this company is working on. So, you know, and incidentally, they cost about 1/6 of the traditional cost to construct, and they're designed to last 30 years. So I'm quite excited about this because I think this is a really potentially a major solution to the issue of creating enough schoolrooms, which we haven't got in the UK, and improving the productivity of them and the well-being in them dramatically. So, you know, if you can build 6 for the price of the old one, that's pretty exciting, I think.
Definitely. No, that definitely is. For me as a designer, sometimes even acoustics will get VE'd out of a project, you know, outside of the ceiling and the flooring, which typically, you know, primarily they'll often be covered. But if we feel like the room could use a little bit more of acoustic help, sometimes the client might not have the budget for it. And it's more of, you know, let's make do with what's there. I love also what you had to say about, you know, building more cost effectively. And, you know, I think that's amazing because everybody deserves to have healthy environments that they spend their time in. So if we can achieve that at lower cost, I just think that's amazing. So another fun question. Are there any sounds that we cannot hear that affects our bodies? For example, you know, like cats can hear certain things that we can't. Are there sounds or frequencies that we are not able to pick up, but they actually have an impact on our body and well-being?
There's no research that I'm aware of which has scientifically shown that. And you're right that different species can hear different bands. For example, elephants and blue whales operate in very low frequencies that we can't hear. So they're subsonic. Whereas dolphins and one particular species of moth can hear up to 150 kilohertz. That's about 4 octaves above what we can hear. Very, very high indeed. So I don't think that high frequency sound, if you can't hear it, it probably isn't having much effect on you. And of course, you know, individual human beings have got different hearing sensitivities. I mean, I've been a drummer all my life, and unfortunately, that means I've lost the top end of my hearing through bashing cymbals before I knew about protecting my ears with appropriate hearing protectors. So I can't hear anything above about 12 kilohertz. A human being with perfect hearing can hear up to 20 kilohertz and down to about 20 hertz. That's our range, although we're most sensitive around 2.5 to 4, that kind of level. Subsonic, I mean, it's possible that that's more impactful. I mean, there have been a lot of people over the years in different places in different countries who've complained about feeling very ill through low frequency sound that you can't actually hear, but it's affecting them. That may be something from the Earth. There's plenty of low frequency sound moving through planets and even stars. I mean, stars ring like bells, but at very, very low frequencies that we can't hear unless we speed them up. So my new book, which is going to be out in spring 25, is full of things like this about the sound of the cosmos, the sound of the earth, the sound of animals. And it's completely gobsmacking when you get into it. Sound is so rich and so extraordinary. There's plenty of sound in space, actually. It's just very, very low frequency, most of it. So it's possible that that has an effect on us, but I'm not aware of any research proving it, other than the anecdotal evidence of the people who feel that they're being made ill by subsonic sound that's not audible.
That's fascinating. I mean, science is discovering new things every day. So I'd love to see if they could do some research around that to see if there's something going on there, you know, if anything. Are there any specific sounds that support the circadian system and support healthier sleep?
Most definitely. And the most obvious example of that is birdsong, which is nature's alarm clock. The dawn chorus is something that human beings have lived alongside for hundreds of thousands of years, and as I said before, that our ancestors for millions of years. So birds have been here far longer than we have on this planet. I mean, they go back to dinosaur times, and the dawn chorus has been here all that time, and it's something that means it's time to wake up, doesn't it? Which is why actually birdsong is a very good sound for working to, because not only is it pleasing, very low cognitive load, but it's also stimulating in that it's telling us to be awake and alert. And therefore, it's a particularly good sound to put on in headphones if you want to block out the irritating conversation around you. Put on headphones, listen to birdsong, and you'll be that much more productive. So that's the most obvious one. There are sounds that you can use, for example, as somebody who has trouble going to sleep, then gentle surf is a very good sound with a cadence of around 12 cycles a minute, roughly, very similar to the breathing of a sleeping human being, and a sound we associate with being relaxed, not a care in the world, on a beach somewhere, and so forth. So it's a sound that's got a lot going for it in terms of relaxation. Association is very, very important with all sound. The sounds that we associate strongly with things are much more impactful on us. And so that's something that's worth thinking about all the time. If we're ever designing sound for a space to put into a space, are there any associations which are positive or negative that we need to think about in that sound? So there's a couple of sounds that bookend a day: birdsong to wake up with, gentle surf to go to sleep with. I would strongly recommend those, and they help clearly with the circadian rhythm. And if you're in the tropics, then you've got the sound of crickets or whatever it might be as night falls, or if you're very unlucky, the sound of mosquitoes around you. That's one you want to avoid. But there are sounds which are associated with certain times of day in certain places. A cock crowing in the morning, and it may be people sounds as well. Church bells, that kind of. There are sounds which are rhythmic, and if we live in a certain place, we get used to the clock chiming, for example. So yes, there could be many sounds that lock us into our circadian rhythm, that reinforce it. And that we might miss if we move somewhere else and move on to a different time zone or into a different space.
I love what you said about association. Where my mind goes when I think about that is meditation. For me, when I set up kind of my space that I use frequently for meditating, I have a specific sound that I play, and that sound helps induce, a different going in more easily to different levels of consciousness. So, as you repeatedly, time and time again, meditate daily and turn on that sound is facilitating your experience of getting to those other states of meditation. So I love that.
Yes, hence chant is very important in huge number of religious or spiritual practices. Mantras, they will have the same function of strong association. It makes it easier to slip into a certain physical, mental, spiritual state. Absolutely.
How would you recommend someone go about designing their home or space so that it's tailored for their own individual ears?
Well, that comes down to personal taste, and a lot of people haven't really ever thought about what sounds they enjoy and what sounds they don't enjoy. I would recommend anybody in their home go into each room, close your eyes, and simply listen and ask yourself, is this the best soundscape I could have in this room for what I want to do in here? Whether it's sleeping in your bedroom, whether it's, waking up in the morning somewhere, whether it's a family space where you want more convivial atmosphere, what would be a great sound that would support and enhance the activity in this space? Or sounds if you have a space that has changed use over time. So that's a very important thing to do. And just asking yourself those questions is going to yield the answers. They'll be different for everybody. And that's why you simply have to look inside and ask the questions. It becomes much more difficult, of course, if you're designing sound in a space that has many people in it, like an office, where I would very much counsel to involve people in whatever it is you're going to put in. People tend to react negatively to any imposition, whether it's painting the walls bright pink without asking them, or imposing a sound on them, whether that's, biophilia or anything else. And certainly I know from Moodsonic's experience around the world in putting these lovely sounds into office spaces that they've been most successful where the people in the space have been involved in the process, understand what it's trying to achieve, and get to make some choices about which particular types of nature sound they enjoy. So the choice is very important. I mean, we tend to consider noise very often to be something that's imposed on us that we didn't have a choice about. That's why there's a huge movement against pipe music in stores, for example. There's even a pressure group in the UK called Pipe Down, which has got some very illustrious members, from Daniel Barenboim to Stephen Fry, all sorts of famous people who really object to having music imposed on them when they're shopping. It's not a choice, and we don't like, a lot of people don't like having imposition like that. And so yes, that's an important aspect of designing in spaces where there's more than one person. But of course, when you're at home, it's completely up to you. And as I say, it might be, wall-to-wall death metal for some people, not for me. But whatever it is that makes you happy, makes you feel good, that you can test and sample and, trial different sounds for working to, for sleeping, and so forth. But the important thing is to be involved in consciously designing the soundscapes around you, asking what's healthy, what's productive, what makes me happy. Those three questions.
I just want to highlight that the exercise that you've recommended for people to kind of go through to design their space for sound individually, it's a profound one. I think, developing that skill set of analyzing how you move throughout your day and then implementing in, different sounds and then reflecting on it and trial and error, that skill set just, I think, folds into all aspects of your life, and it really adds to a deeper level of understanding of yourself. So I think that's really important. And I want to highlight, just that ripple effect, and also that kind of bleeds to all types of design. So yeah, thank you for that. I'd love it if you could share a success story from Moodsonic.
Well, I'm not actively involved day to day in Moodsonic. I helped to launch it, but it's not me. It's run by a guy called Evan Benway, and he's doing a wonderful job. They have a client in Australia where they've designed sound journeys based on an Australian island, which has got different territories on it. And at different times of the day and in different places in this office, you can be in different parts of that island. There's, there's shoreline, there's swamps, there's forests, there's all sorts of different environments which have got different beautiful soundscapes. So people can also choose where they want to go. I think it's a really clever piece of taking local sound and bringing it into the office. Bringing the outside inside is what that's a relatively trivial description of biophilia. I mean, I think at a more profound level, it's reconnecting human beings with the sound of nature, which is very important because we are getting more and more divorced from that, working in sterile, totally artificial environments for hours and hours. We spend 95% of our lives indoors now, I think, or 93%. I mean, it's unbelievable. So the amount of time we actually spend in nature is very reduced. And although there's pushbacks against that, is it Shinrin Yoku, the Japanese, tree walks and tree experience, which seems to be getting very, very popular around the world. So a lot of people are feeling the need to get back into the sound, the smell, the sight, the feel, even the taste of nature. We can do a lot to bring that into offices and make them less sterile, more fulfilling. more healthy. And so I think that's a great example in Australia. But if you have a look at the Moodsonic website, they have case studies on there which you can look at. And I'm sure they've got new ones now.
I love that. And, it reminded me of a little soundscaping that I've done for my home in the city. So, where I grew up, there is this body of water where there's really soft waves, and it's my favorite wave sound in the world. And I know I'm biased, but it also just produces a different physiological effect on me. So, what I did was I went down there and I recorded the waves and I brought it back to my home in the city. And I would play that to help kind of induce more relaxation for me and all the other wonderful feelings that I associate with that place. So that's interesting in terms of the example that you gave. And then, just in terms of Moodsonic in general, I'm definitely going to check out the case studies. I'd love to hear more about the different projects and what they entailed exactly. Thank you for sharing that. So let's wrap things up with a fun question. What would be your favorite sound in the world?
Gentle rain on leaves outside a window on a summer night. That would be my number one. And I don't think you can beat it. Just behind that, I suppose, would be a breeze in leaves in late summer when the leaves are quite brittle. And you get these waves of gorgeous sound as the leaves bump into each other. So those two.
I love that. And those sounds are absolutely magical. Well, thank you, Julian, for being with us today. It was an absolute pleasure to have you on the show. And I just know that listeners gained a tremendous amount of information here on how to better design their spaces for their ears. And also, for anyone who's designing a workspace, as Julian mentioned, Moodsonics is a great company and resource to go to for biophilic sounds for your office environment. Thank you, Julian.
Wonderful. Well, thank you.
That's it for this episode. Please remember before you go to subscribe below. You can also check us out on Instagram at bestkind.design or our website at bestkind.design. Bestkind Design's interior services are also available for hire. So if you have a residential, commercial, or a hospitality project, we'd love to hear from you. You can reach us at info@bestkind.design. Until next time, be well.